good shoe store.
Thanks. I'm heading over to see Dennis now.
That's the Cobblery in Wallala, open 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., Monday through Saturday, closed Sundays.
Hey, everybody. Good morning. Peggy Berryhill here with you, along with our special guest we'll be talking to in just a couple of minutes, Kent Blanchett. I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time, and we're going to talk about this book. I'm going to show you right here. Journey to Freedom, Richard Oakes, Alcatraz, and the Red Power Movement. And of course, we here at KGUA and in the Redwood Coast have a special connection to that because Richard Oakes was assassinated just south of here in Sonoma County on the Kashire Rancheria or next to it. We're going to talk about all of that and more, but that's where his journey for freedom ended. And, and a lot went on here in the 70s. I just have one quick announcement coming up at the Coast Community Library. Now, I don't know about you, but I have always loved to read. I've been reading since I was they tell me since I was 3 and hanging out at the library since I could, get there. And we have a wonderful library up in Point Arena, Coast Community Library, and they are reopened. We are all unmasked. We're all hugging again. I mean, it's just wonderful. If you want to wear masks, that's cool. It's optional too. Sometimes I wear mine when I'm in the big city like Santa Rosa. But there's a whole bunch of reading stuff going on this summer. And through July 23rd, of your ages 0 to 12, they're asking you to log 7 hours of reading. If you're from 12 to 109, well, I kind of fit in there. I don't know about you, but I do. Log in 15 hours to complete. And the county-wide community goal is 100,000 minutes. Well, I can tell you that I'm not at 100,000, but I'm well over. I can't tell you how many minutes. I have a tendency when I rest on the weekends, it's reading a junk thriller. And I can read a couple of those a weekend. So, and then during the week, I'm reading more. So I'm pretty well got my pages in. But this really cool event is happening coming on Monday, June 28th. Our very own Mendonoma Sightings, Jeannie Jackson, will be at the Coast on YouTube with our wonderful librarian, Julia Lark. And they're going to be taking a look at favorite baby animal sightings. How fun is that? Now, Kent, you don't know what we're talking about here, but we have a local columnist named Jeannie Jackson. Her article is every week, and it's called Mendonoma Sightings, and it's basically citizens like you and me. If we see a muskrat, we write to Jeannie, and if we get a picture of it, even better. And so every week she tells us, what flowers are up and what tule elk has been seen or what the starfish are doing or whatever. And it's just a great community resource. So we all take, great pride in Jeannie's work. And Jeannie comes to my show the third Thursday of every month. So when she says she's going to show you photos of baby animals, she also has an army of the best photographers on the coast. So if somebody says, I think I just saw the gray whales up in Manchester. Well, she'll just get on the phone or the email and she'll notify whoever the photographers are in that area, and they take off. They take off with their long lenses and they report them back to us. And of course, she has a webpage, MendonomaSightings.com. So that's a little bit of what it's like living out here, Ken. We are on the edge of the coast, on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, where we just love it. The redwoods are here. So good morning, Kent.
Good morning. Good morning from Kansas.
Kansas. Yeah. So are you at Haskell?
We are affiliated, but I'm with the University of Kansas. So I'm the Langston Hughes Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History. And then we do a lot of bridge programs with Haskell. So Haskell students can take classes at KU for free and the vice versa.
Wow, you might know my nephew, Jim Raines. He's over at Haskell.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my nephew. His wife and one of his daughters are coming to visit this weekend. So I'm so excited. Haley is getting her doctorate at Davis, and she's a photographer, so filmmaker. So anyway, it's all in the family here. And of course, I was born not too far from there in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, which you probably know about. I don't know if you've been there. Well, Kent is an amazing mix of Cherokee, Greek, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Potawatomi descendants, and from the Blanket, Panther, and Smith families. And as he said, he's the Langston Hughes Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies. I love that, Langston Hughes. How cool is that? I mean,
It was an incredible honor, and it's a wonderful program that they have at KU for recruiting faculty of color into KU, and so you hold the title for 2 years as a Langston Hughes professor, and then after that 2 years, they use the endowments to recruit another faculty person of color to be able to kind of increase diversity at the University of Kansas. So next year is my last year holding the Langston Hughes, but it's an honor just kind of walking in his footsteps a bit.
no kidding. Well, that is so cool. Now, your book came out a couple of years ago, and it's, the book, again, I'm going to show by the way, we're also live on YouTube. If you guys want to go to our KGUA YouTube page and you can see us, watch us talk. But this is the book we're talking about this morning, and you can get it at all the usual sources. And you can see, Ken, I've got a few places marked. I probably won't get to all of those. But the book was very interesting to me in particular because I grew up in the Bay Area. I am a first generation urban Indian, and with all that carries with it, but I'm from the Oakland side, so we weren't in here much. This is mainly about the San Francisco Indian community. And I have to say, I know just about everybody in the book, growing up there, and lots of interviews in my years with all of those people that are currently locked up down at UC Santa Barbara with all of my archives from the 70s and 80s. But we'll talk about the book in just a second. So let me, I want to ask you about your background a little bit and why you decided to get a doctorate in history. What was your reasoning behind that?
That's a great question. So I struggled a lot. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Missouri, I did a dual degree in history and Native American studies, and I think it was the only second Native person to get a interdisciplinary degree in Native studies from the University of Missouri. And while I was there, I got involved in the repatriation movement. And they have about 3,000 remains of our ancestors that they kept in plastic bags and paper sacks. And I just found it completely disheartening as a young 18-year-old to think about my grandparents or my relatives being treated in such a way that their human rights and civil rights were being stripped away from them, that they were being treated as some sort of experimentation for students to practice upon. And so it really went against our fundamental belief systems as Indigenous peoples. And I remember I began to start working with the American Indian movement at that point, more particularly Mike Haney, who is Seminole Lakota out of Oklahoma and was a part of the Oklahoma AIM chapter, as well as Dennis Banks. And so I started getting involved more so with the American Indian movement. And so part of my training was not just leading a protest movement for 4 years to get those ancestors returned and get the university to make a public statement that they were going to seek repatriation, which was a great end result, but also functioned in going out to Big Mountain and learning a little bit more about Peabody Coal Company and trying to overturn Public Law 93531, and going to spring gathering and talking with the elders there, and then doing grant research at the Santee Nation. And so I tended to, instead of most kids going to spring break in Fort Lauderdale, I went to different reservation communities to see where I could help out. And then on the weekends, I would travel to Kansas City and I'd work with urban Indian youth and tutoring. And I decided at that point, when I was working for Visible Horizons, that I really wanted, I love this teaching thing. And I decided too that I would go in a different direction. I went from working with AIM to then taking an internship with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and worked under Ada Deer, who I was in a Wayne's World moment with, because I read about her in my undergrad, and I just thought the world of her.
Wayne's World moment. That's pretty funny.
And so, yeah, just a huge fanboy of hers. And anyway, I worked in the bureau, and then I kind of got to see a different side of things, and I got to interview people that were in the bureau during the takeover in '72, and so I saw another side of activism at that point. And after that, went to University of New Mexico, and I taught my first course on history of Native math and science, and loved it, and decided I got to do this full time, but I want to do it at a collegiate level. So to do so, I needed to get a PhD, and I loved writing. At one point, I was going to go into poetry and playwriting, and I'd worked with Waikiknabe Theater Company in New Mexico, and which is an all-indigenous theater company. And poetry and theater really helped me to develop an idea for narrative writing, for action in writing, to think about the story and the impact of being a storyteller. And how that's pulled from our community and community ties. So all that kind of, just propelled me piece by piece into the PhD program. And I completed the PhD in 2011. And my first teaching job, which I loved, was at the University of Minnesota Morris, which was a former federal Indian boarding school that was run by the Sisters of Mercy and then later by the federal government. And since then, it's one of the 2 public institutions that has free tuition for Native students. So we had about 18% of our student body at Morris was Indigenous. So that was really great, to be able to teach there. And I love the students, and I love the faculty. And then I got another teaching gig at University of Nebraska, Omaha, where I taught there for about 6 years. And then just this last year, started teaching at KU, having accepted the new position. So yeah, the PhD has taken me in multiple different directions. This project on Richard Oakes came out of my activism. I remember when I was an undergrad and I was trying to think about, how do we do a protest, and what has been done before us, and what is Red Power, and what has our relatives done before us, in that subsequent generation. I began just reading everything I could, devouring books on Red Power. And I kept seeing a name, Richard Oakes, in regards to Alcatraz, but there wasn't much known about him. It was like, he was husky, he was charismatic, he was, a former iron worker. These were like the typical stories about Richard, and he was a leader in the takeover of Alcatraz. And then, he just kind of disappears from the narrative. And then somewhere in 1972, there was conflicting reports about his death. And so at that, it kind of stuck in my head, like, why don't we know more about this individual? I mean, because he obviously was at one of the more, pivotal moments in Indigenous history in the modern era. This is our March on Washington, is that takeover of Alcatraz.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there, because you said a lot of things, and I want to kind of unbundle some of those. And we're very glad you did write about Richard Oakes, because he is forgotten in some ways in history. And it's very interesting reading the book that you pay very little attention to, Dennis and John Trudell. There's some pictures of very young John Trudell. And of course, that's sort of where he got started by, they had that transmitter that KPFA gave them, and, transmitting from the island. But Richard Oakes was a powerful figure. Before we go directly to the book, though, I have to say that your road that you took through all of school and protests and then university, that red road is such a powerful road to take. And so many of our, well, now, yeah, younger people, it's the more traditional route. Before the 60s, before the protests, and at first we had a plethora of we were graduating attorneys, and then we had more attorneys than we could possibly need. Well, no, you always need a lot of attorneys, unfortunately, but in Indian law is sort of a brand new area in law. Let's face it, that's something that hasn't been explored and is continually explored. But I think that road that you took, that so many younger people now is becoming normal, and the route to becoming educated and to teaching. And I think that's terrific. And I just really think that the road that you took, it just sounded so like so many younger people. It was certainly the route that many of us took, and being of the generation that was in a lot of these places at the covering them as a young journalist. No idea that it would carry me through 50 years of reporting and sharing Native voices and the importance of that history. So I thank you for that. And in focusing, let's now talk about Native rights, because what I really enjoyed about your book, aside from the history of Richard Oakes, and we're going to talk about Richard Oakes, folks, don't worry, we're going to get to Richard Oakes and Kashaya, but making that differentiation, a really, really good discussion about what makes Native activism, as it's called, and it's much more beyond activism, Native sovereignty movement, so different from the Brown Berets or the Black Power or even Me Too, movement. Why Native rights are so different, and why they are so, why the government doesn't like them. I mean, where else, have they brought in water canyons to people?
Yeah.
All the things that were done at Standing Rock and continue to be done with Native people, then the people have no recognition, no understanding about what tribal sovereignty is and what it means. And people are still confused that, they probably come to you too and say, well, now, and in fairness, this is not to make fun of anybody, ridicule. I mean, they're seriously asking, well, do I call you an indigenous person, or do I call you an Indian or a Native? And, I want to do the right thing, but I don't know what's right. That kind of confusion that this government has allowed to happen, and I'm putting it right back on the government and the education system, that in 2020, people don't have that much understanding of who we are and what it means today. So I think your book has done a great service to helping understand that. But it is a bit scholarly, and and that's how Native sovereignty is scholarly. To understand the Constitution, to understand this government, to understand Native sovereignty, they're all one and the same. And you can't just, people just don't get that. So let's go back and talk again. I'm going to show our audience the book again. Like I said, you can get it at all the regular places. And I told a lot of people I was going to be talking to you. And let's step back for a moment and explain how we met just recently.
Yeah, we met at the Sounds of Sovereignty symposium that was hosted by Humanities Kansas here in Kansas, and we were able to talk about the legacies of sovereignty in regards to media and radio, and that long history and contemporary history of Indigenous peoples taking control of the airwaves, so to speak. And that's really important because it's indigenizing those airways, and it's educating. And I think it, has this rippling effect going from, like what you said, the KPFA, Alcatraz, Radio Free Alcatraz, shows that were nationally syndicated. Now this is, grown into Native American calling. It's grown into localized radio shows. It's grown into this movement, which is an educational movement at its heart, I think. Like you were saying, the problem in this country is that, we desegregated in the sense of bodies. the classroom, but we never desegregated the curriculum in this country. And so the problem is we're still oftentimes in the K through 12 districts going all throughout this country, Indigenous studies is minuscule in the way it's been taught, in the way it's being taught even in colleges to upcoming teachers. They get very little Indigenous studies curriculum. And so the pattern continues. I mean, we're essentially, operating in desegregated schools by body, but we're still operating in a 1950s educational stream. And that's scary, and that's frightening. And that's another reason why I wanted to get it into education, is to make a difference in that matter, to be able to educate the next generation, to push from the inside for greater training of teachers to get their educational requirements. So that sounds of sovereignty, just keeps going. And it was just a pleasure to be able to meet you. And I'd known of your story for years. And so I was also quite a fan of yours from your NPR days as well. So this is really a full circle for me to be able to be on your show. So
Wow.
I thank you for that.
Well, thank you for all of that. And yes, I really, that's the way you said we've desegregated bodies, but not the curriculum. What a great statement that is. Well, and yes, and that's why, when I got dubbed with that title, the First Lady of Native Radio, there were only 3 Native stations and about 6 independent radio shows across the country. And that is what spurred me on to say, okay, however, we can do this. And after being at NPR, we can do this. We can do this together, and joined with my friend Susan Brain and a few other people. And before we knew it, Susan and I were literally, well, not literally, but figuratively, kicking down doors at the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and got into boardrooms and made the case for Native radio. And now we have 68 stations. And yes, we have our wonderful network, Native Voice One, and voices from everywhere. And I'm so happy to see that happen, and it happened the way it should have, autonomously. Maybe not the way I would have wanted to see it, but that's because I'm a journalist. I want more content of other types, but that's okay. And the CBC, of course, does an amazing job. They're great, but yet they just had a big problem in Canada, just like here, like, oh, Native children dying in boarding schools. Gee, we didn't know that. Well, it was known. So anyway, all of this is time for us now to talk about how, out of this book, again, A Journey to Freedom. How did you come up with that title, A Journey to Freedom? What kind of freedom are we talking about here?
That's a great question. The title kind of stuck with me a bit, partly because I don't think in a lot of the conversations that we have, we talk a lot about sovereignty in Indian country, but we don't really take it one step further and talk about what does that idea of freedom mean in Indigenous terms? How do we define freedom? Not how freedom is defined for us by the federal government. Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes a really interesting notion of liberation. That what was happening on the island, when you go there and you see a lot of the political statements, which have been also miscalled graffiti. But when you see those political statements that have been painted on the sides of buildings that are still there on the island, the number one word that kept coming up time and again was free or freedom. And I found that to be just liberating in a contemporary sense. I mean, my own journey to get out to the island, I didn't make it out there until about 2000. And I always tell people I get to this in the end of the book. It was just kind of this decolonizing experience for me. And the way the island had been written about for so many years is it had been written as a failure. Because we didn't get the cultural center, we didn't get the travel college, we didn't get the title to the island. So, we spent 19 months there and it came to nothing. Other than a side journey for a tour on Alcatraz. And I think of it as much more than that. I think of it as a successful movement. And I wanted to write a book that talked about Alcatraz as a success and how do we re-envision it as a success. And so that journey for me was important. In 2000, I got on the boat, and I remember, I wanted to get to the front of the boat, of the ferry boat, because I wanted to see, where did Richard jump off of the boat and start making that swim. And so that nerd in me was just like, okay, I'm going to the front of the boat. I want to feel the sea spray on me. I want to see what the waves are like. I want to feel the current. I want to feel the breeze. I want to see what that Golden Gate looks like, as you're approaching the island. And as that boat kind of turns and veers around the island, there's the dock on the other side. And that dock, what greets you is that Indian's welcome sign. And for me, as a Native person, I'd never seen a welcome sign ever. And it just like hit me. Why have I never seen this? Why have I not felt this in my own country? And that was freeing, because it liberated my mind. At that point, it taught me, someone, in 2000 was being spoken to by kids from 1969 that took over this island as students, that literally had a reverberation into the present day, that it's still speaking to us. It's still symbolic. It is a symbol now. It is a place of monument. It is a place of memory about conquest. It's a place of memory about indigenous rights, and the ability to be able to teach thousands of people every day. As 10,000 people a day go to Alcatraz Island, 5 million people a year circulate through that island. They're exposed to Indians' welcomes. They're exposed to Indian freedom, and they have to think about it.
Wow.
And it's a teaching moment.
Professor Blansett, I could listen to you. I love the way you talk about these things. I could take classes from you, and I love the way you write about it. And to remind people, you're listening to Peggy's Place this morning on KGUA in Wallala. And my guest today is Professor Ken Blansett from the University of Kansas, who wrote this wonderful book, Journey to Freedom, about Richard Oakes and the Alcatraz and Red Power movement. And we're going to talk seriously about that. We've already started. And what you just said, my friend Eric Wilder, who is the former tribal chairman of Kashaya, he's an amazing artist, a singer, a spiritual person, and just a wonderful person. He comes on my show once a month, the second Tuesday of the month. And he said the same thing. He was 11, I think, when they went to Alcatraz. And he said the same thing. He said, for the first time, Indians welcome. He said, I felt like I was on Indian land, and it felt great. It just felt great. And that kind of feeling that you're saying, and I could see you tearing up a little bit there, that feeling of that freedom of, yes, I belong. This is ours. This is ours. And that just so rarely happens. Or maybe when those of us go back home, if we haven't been home, being our reservations or rancherias, if we haven't been there in a while, and you see your cousins and you see everybody and yeah, this is where I'm from. They all look like me. We all talk alike, you feel that. But nowhere else in the United States do you feel that welcoming. Do you feel, I'm home. I'm home. And and turning around Alcatraz as an image of failure or just militancy, this activism and militancy, not understanding sovereignty. I'm going to get to the book now, and we have quite a bit of time left, but just so many things. We started talking about Richard Oakes and Ganawagi, where he was from. And some people may know the history, but a few don't. But the building, New York City, the World Trade Towers would not have been built without Mohawk iron workers. And that is the kind of community that he was born into. Why they had no fear of heights, who knows, or, if that's a stereotype, but a lot of them became iron workers. But you cover in the book the history of the community of Ganawagi, which very few people understand. And at a time when Richard Oakes was coming of age, like me, a little much younger, the age of termination. And that was one of the things that Richard Oakes identified as he was fighting against his whole short life against termination. So could you, first of all, just give us a few sentences, if you can, about the Ganawaki Haudenosaunee Nation, and then a little bit about termination.
Yeah, so Richard grows up at Akwesasne, in which is a sister community for Ganawage, and Ganawage is kind of like across the river from Montreal on the Canadian side, and Akwesasne is really interesting because it's straddles the Canadian-U.S. border. So half the res is in the Canadian side, the other half is on the U.S. side. His mother comes from the Canadian side, his father from the U.S. side. And so his mother had to go to residential school. His father went to public school. His father was also involved in D-Day. The Oakes family in general were all code talkers as well. Levi Oakes being the most recent that was an honoree. But their sister community at Ganawage really extended the ironworking trade to Akwesasne. And then, of course, from there, it spread out to all Haudenosaunee peoples, the Seneca, as well as Onondaga, and quite a few others. Cayugas were all involved with the ironworking profession. And Mohawks ended up building a community in Brooklyn where Richard would grow up and become a part of this ironworking tradition, following suit with his dad and growing up in Brooklyn, but also spending summers back at home at Akwesasne with his grandparents and learning those traditions of the longhouse. So he once described Akwesasne as essentially 3,000 square miles with 3,000 problems and 3,000 people kind of thing, or 6 miles square. And so it was one of those things that for Richard, he understood the politics of his community. He understood the politics of his day. They got involved in the St. Lawrence Seaway project, which was one of the largest seaway expansion projects of the St. Lawrence that would begin taking lands away from Akwesasne for this great project to be able to move mass amounts of trade into the Great Lakes region. And Richard fought against that. He grew up at a time when Kinzawood Dam was also a controversy. And that became very political to the point where at least Haudenosaunee leaders like Clinton Ricard and others were protesting before the United Nations. So he grew up in a very politically charged community, and that politics didn't leave when they went to Brooklyn. Those politics stayed. They didn't cease being Mohawks. They essentially, that native nationalism, if you will, heightened in that period. And they began to indigenize that city and making it a Mohawk city or a Haudenosaunee city. And that's really brilliant because he also learned the core of leadership from working in ironworking. Like you mentioned, it's very dangerous work. And it's for that there was no discrimination. If you're willing to work 60 floors up without a harness or safety net, then yeah, it's high pay, but it's dangerous work and you could lose your life. So very few people wanted to do it. So they had a hard time recruiting workers. And this is where the Haudenosaunee people could really take a commanding force. And they approximately commanded about 15% of the ironworking labor force, building that impressive skyline. And when I look at that skyline of Manhattan, looking at the Chrysler Building and Empire State Building, you got to know that that's built by indigenous hands. And the fact that we don't know that takes us away from this idea that we as indigenous peoples are part of modernity. And we construct that modernity. We help in that modernity. We built that greatest city in the world. And Richard became a part of that greater experience before moving at least to San Francisco.
Great. That's a wonderful synopsis of that era. And not only did we fight for this nation, we built this nation in so many ways, and yet have no respect or history about that. Well, then Richard ends up, and because of time, I'm going to move fast forward a little bit here. And the era of termination, which was the 50s, and this whole thing of, yes, if you move the Indian, it's that old thing of killing the Indian, and if you move them off of their homelands and away from their people, they're going to stop being Indian. That's what relocation was about. Didn't work that way. It has never worked that way, because you can't take that away from us, and we're still going to go home. And we're still, and today now, of course, it's even stronger with social media and Zoom and all of this stuff. We're even closer to each other than we were before. So that, you know, the strength of our individuality as in citizens of tribal nations and as sovereign nations are getting, I think, stronger. Getting much stronger, and as we've gotten more educated. Well, let's move forward a little bit. So Richard ends up out here and getting married to a wonderful Kashaya woman who is buried up at Cuffy's Cove, I believe. She's up there now. His children, I think, are still around. But you talk about so many people here that we grew up with. Lynetta Means, who's now Lynetta Warjack, and all of the people that were involved in relocation. And again, like I say, you talk primarily about the San Francisco Indian area, which of course I knew. And I grew up across the bay where there was a lot of Indians also. And to me, this interesting. I think it's an important book, but that this roots of the Red Power movement. Let's talk about that Red Power movement for a little bit. And if you could tell us what you think, how it's defined, what makes it different.
Yeah, it seemed to be like a lot of what we have scholarly about the Red Power movement to what people are as common knowledge about the movement is oftentimes tied into the American Indian movement. It's tied into Wounded Knee in 1973. It's tied into the takeover in 72, the BIA. It's tied into, the shootout in 75 and Leonard Peltier's false imprisonment. So there becomes a legacy where what most people know is that iconic era of the 1970s as Red Power. They see it as oftentimes they tie the term militantism with it. And what I began to realize in writing this book is that that's a false image of what Red Power is, and that the origins of Red Power, there's multiple movements that are happening simultaneously. That's the Minneapolis St. Paul movement coming out with the Belcourts, Dennis Banks, as well as, Russell Means coming out of Ohio, kind of forming this larger kind of movement. But that movement forms partly because of Alcatraz, and what was happening on the West Coast is really the origins of the movement. That Richard is coming from this long legacy of Haudenosaunee leadership in the Longhouse, the White Roots of Peace Caravan, which is an incredible influence upon his life. The Great Peacemaker's Message is a part of that movement. So it's also coming from this nonviolent space, which is direct action. It's being influenced a little bit by the sit-ins from SNCC in the 1960s to voter registration drives and taking power into one's own hands, in order to make the change and to create direct action tactics that force the hands of media to begin to educate a greater populace and hopefully change legislation for the better, like the passage of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, all came from direct action, but nonviolent resistance. And I think many people within the West Coast movement, going from the Fishins movement in Washington State, which is occurring in 1964, but has an even earlier origin going all the way back to the 1940s even, and one could argue even into the 1920s and 19-teens, or even after the passage or the signing of treaties for the Nisqually, the Puyallup, and others, was this idea that, one has to get arrested, and one has to bring this to the court systems, and one has to begin challenging these destructive policies like termination. And we have to begin enforcing treaty rights and the power of treaty rights, which speak to the sovereignty of the United States government. Meaning, if the United States government doesn't honor these treaties, it speaks to the fact that they don't have the power to honor these treaties. We have to reverse how we begin to look at that, right? It attacks US sovereignty as much as it does indigenous sovereignty, because these were treaties that were signed not under duress. We were not conquered people. We signed these treaties in regards to creating an alliance with the United States. And this becomes another way we reframe things. We get out of that John Wayne Western moment of conquer and conquest, and we begin to realize that we were signing these treaties from positions oftentimes of power, not positions of conquer. It's how these treaties were then handled. It is how these provisions were not handled appropriately that got us into this perplexing situation of a lack of honor by the federal government's commitment to these treaties. So the West Coast movement, starting with the Fishins and then going into Alcatraz and then carrying forth from Alcatraz into Northern California, these were all being led as nonviolent movements in that time period. It was being led by men and women. It was Richard Oakes and Lynetta Means, right? Lynetta coming from Berkeley, Richard coming from San Francisco State. So men and women working together to take over this island. And there's these famous pictures of in the book of Richard with his arms around Annie Oakes, who is from Kashaya. And I love that picture. The main reason that I love that picture is that he's showing affection as a Native man. He's showing a modern Native family. He's showing love in a time of absolute chaos, conflict, and violence, at a time when, in 1968, we just had the Democratic National Convention that was a circus of police hitting protesters on the national news. We have people dying in Vietnam. We have hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets. And then we have this image of love coming from an Indigenous man and Indigenous woman on the island who have brought their family there to basically take an enormous risk. I mean, the people on the island, they didn't know when the Coast Guard was coming. They didn't know when the military was coming. They didn't know when cops were coming. And a time period which was expected. If they're cracking skulls in Chicago, what are they going to do to people on Alcatraz in 1969? The only intervention here is that we're families. And they were showcasing this on the news, and the media was helping this, right? To showcase that it's not just families, but we were creating a community, a free community. We were showing that we can run our own schools. We can manage our own affairs. We can manage our own governance. We can manage our own people. We don't need a manager appointed for us in the terms of the federal government and its paternalism any longer. And this became the symbolic definition of sovereignty in action on the island. And it was this liberation that was catching on. But it was, as I say, Richard's most famous statement was, Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea. And the thing about that was, the empowering idea of that is that what you could do on Alcatraz could be taken to other places. That oftentimes what people have written about in regards to the movement of Alcatraz is they've landlocked it to just the island. And Indians of all tribes was running activism, and as an organization operating even off of the island. They were taking water out to Pyramid Lake and dumping it in Pyramid Lake to showcase, how Pyramid Lake, a sacred lake for the Pyramid River Paiute, was shrinking and was about to basically become extinct. And so it was drawing attention to those issues. It was going to LM, it was going to Clear Lake, it was going to Kashaya, it was going to Pitt River, and participating in direct action. It was going to Seattle for the takeover of Fort Lawton. All these became the extension of the Indians of all tribes, and it was an incredible West Coast movement. But this is dwarfed by this perception that people need to see of us as the militant. They need to see the John Wayne. They need to see us raising an AK-47 over our head rather than speaking truth to power.
I will say that also California Indians were not seen as Indian. They weren't seen, period, but are seen as Indians. And having the colorful AIM guys there, they're the ones that got most of the visuals and the credit. And yet there was, as you say, with the fishing rights, and I was just up there a couple of years ago. I don't know if you were there, but when Indigenous Environmental Network had a huge conference at Frank's Landing, and it was just awesome. And, they too came out with a school and all of their stories. Women of Red Nations was born there, Russell and Dennis and John Trudell went to learn from Janet McLeod how to, they were schooled there. Of course, they took it away and turned it into their own thing, but they learned about sovereignty from those people. They learned what native rights meant. And it all did come from the West Coast. I'm so glad you're emphasizing that point because so few people know the Pitt River movement. And if I was up there at Pitt River again, some of these are in my files somewhere. And maybe I met Richard Oakes. I don't know because it was definitely in 72, something like that, I think, when I was up there at those occupations, early days. All of this, folks, here in California, and particularly right here in our area in Mendocino County with Sonoma just south of us. We've only got a few minutes left. We're going to have to do more conversations. I can't, because I'm going to fast forward us to Kushaya. And how, because as you say, most people know a lot about the Alcatraz movement, not about how it made you feel. That was so important. Not about how it made Eric Wilder feel as a child, not about that importance of Lynetta Warjack, what she came out of it, the Hintel Charter School in Oakland, the young leaders today, Morningstar Golly, who is rising and rising. She's my niece actually, but so all of these people who came out of that, but there's a difference in style and manner and understanding of people here on the West Coast. And I must say, in my long history, I have found California natives to be the strongest and toughest people that I've ever worked with. And it's not easy for any of us, whether you're a Kent Blanstead or a Peggy Berryhill. You can't just show up on any res and say, hi, I want to, let's talk. It just does not work that way. But to get again, this wonderful book, I want to get back though to, we're going to fast forward. So Richard Oakes goes back to Kushaya. And at that time, I also wanted to remind people that Eric's grandmother and aunt were there. The great healer, Essie Parrish, Mabel McKay were there. They were youngish people, but that was really the sort of a very high period in Kushaya and the spiritual leadership that was going on. And they were watching with a very serious eye what was going on in Alcatraz and deciding how that impacted them or not. And after Richard's murder, it came the Trail of Tears, the Trail of Broken Treaties. I hadn't realized until I read your book that connection. Again, a lot of this is history that I sort of knew because I was there, I was young, but to be able to go back and have it put together the way you've done is just so important to thread that needle, as they say, so we can see that here. So at that time in California, it was a bad time to be Indians. And I'm going to play just a very short film. I think this will, hopefully it's going to be on the screen. I've got share screen on here. And we're going to talk some more about Richard Oakes' murder.
What I was told happened here was in this area that we're standing, there used to be a horse corral here. And when he was assassinated here, what I was told was that when they came down here, guys that had been working here and knew this area very well, they were, older guys in their 20s at that time, they said there was where the corral was, he was laying outside of that corral on the roadway here. And then he said when the police officers came, the workers had moved the fence out toward the road more. And so when they came, it made it look like, they said it made it look like his body was inside the corral area on their property. And he said you could see the fresh post holes that were, where the old post holes used to be. And so, so it just they made it look like he was on their property trespassing, so that was the big thing that was talked about that I remember growing up.
And this is the area where the horse corral was. This is the old YMCA camp. And of course, that was Eric Wilder. And this is east of Kashaya on Skag Springs Road. So that gives you an idea. And Eric was 11 at that time that happened. So I don't know if you've been to Kashaya or seen what it's like out here in our redwoods. So that for the audience here, many of them may know that area. But it was really, and we took that a couple of weeks ago. We took that little trip up there. And at that time, I also want to help people understand when Eric was 11, he and a friend of his were just playing on the rancheria, and this pickup truck with two white guys came on into town. As all of you know, it's just one road, houses on either side. And they said, wow, look, there's a couple of those, and I'm not going to use the expletives, but referring to them, these young Indian kids, and they cocked their rifles and they started shooting at them, these 11-year-old Indian boys. And I have a little video of that too, where Eric shows us the trees where he and his friend hid in the redwood trees, and he tears up the leaves and he says, I just remember, from the shots, the leaves all being filtering down. That's what it was like growing up here in the 60s and 70s. And of course, no one, they don't know who it was that shot Eric and his friend when they were just 11 years old. And of course, why don't you fill us in on what happened to Richard Oakes?
Yeah, so Northern California at this point in time, like you were saying quite eloquently, suffered from Indian Jim Crow. There was still people that viewed Native peoples or Indigenous peoples as a product of bodies that needed to be segregated, bodies that needed to be controlled, conquered. They had grown up on, a daily diet of John Wayne movies, a daily diet of seeing us as enemies, a daily diet of a school curriculum that viewed us as lesser than. And out of this, there was an intense amount of hate in communities, especially border town communities, to a lot of the rancherias and reservations throughout Northern California. And several people had also been killed, their assailants being white. They were freed in Northern California courts of law. I think there was 6 people that I documented even before Richard in the book that had also been killed and their assailants found free, because you got an all-white jury, you got an all-white judge. They all grew up with the same understandings that we just talked about. That idea of Indian Jim Crow invaded the legal system. There was no justice for Indian peoples. And so this was very much like the fear that we see being talked about with George Floyd currently, was a very real fear about who do you talk to, who do you not talk to, how do you teach your kids not to get killed by that intense hate, how do you survive that hatred? Well, Richard Oakes was a voice that was to cut through that red tape. He was to cut through that Indian Jim Crow that was plaguing Northern California. And part of this was that he was also butting heads with multinational corporations like Kimberly-Clark and PG&E Corporation and others that even Aaron Brockovich in the 1980s would get a lighter version of dealing with than what indigenous activists at that time were exposed to. And so he had made a name for himself. He had successes with Alcatraz. He had success with the Fort Lawton takeover, which was now the Daybreak Star Indian Center in Seattle. He'd had successful takeovers of PG&E campground lands where they were charged with trespass that would bring the president of PG&E Corporation into the courtroom, Shermer Sibley at the time, because stockholders were really afraid that they didn't have original title to land, which the courts found. Pitt River held original title to those lands. They never ceded those lands to the federal government, and yet all their resources have been misappropriated by these corporations, and they were going to be at least needing to pay back millions of dollars. So Richard was kind of in the news all the way from 1969 into 1972 up until his death. He was still in the news quite frequently. He was known in the region And there was one individual that they moved in to be the director of the Y camp. His name was Michael Oliver Morgan. Morgan happened to be a retired or military police officer, so he had a military background and or training. He would have 2 prior attempts on Richard Oakes' life where he would pull a gun on Richard, and this is a really important point. Every time that he'd pull a gun on Richard, Richard would turn his back to Morgan. And this was a way of being able to say, I don't have a gun, I'm not afraid of you, I'm essentially diffusing the situation. And this was an idea to say, you know, you don't want to be a coward that shoots somebody in the back. You don't want to be a Robert Ford shooting Jesse James. And so Richard essentially was trying to challenge this situation by diffusing it in a nonviolent way, turning the other cheek, turning the back, so to speak, to a gun. In the third engagement, Morgan actually took out a Welder P38 9mm, which is a German Luger gun. This would not be addressed in the court of law, this issue of white supremacy, this issue of an affixation on Nazi propaganda, the fact that this was a gun of the Nazi Republic. Was never brought up in the court of law. Morgan would take this loaded gun. He heard that Richard Oakes was walking down Skag Springs Road. He was going to meet an attorney for California Indian Legal Services to talk about how this YMCA camp was actually on Kashaya land, to begin taking that camp back as Kashaya property. And in the course of this, Morgan takes the loaded gun, walks towards Skag Springs Road. He says that Richard Oakes jumped out from behind a redwood tree and attacked him, and that in self-defense, he had to kill Richard Oakes. Well, the evidence speaks loudly to something else happening here that was more nefarious, which was the fact that Morgan had perfect intent to assassinate Richard Oakes. This was cold-blooded murder. He went there with a loaded gun, anticipating a confrontation with Oakes. And part of this was that we see this through the autopsy. When you go into the court records, the hole on Richard's chest, where Morgan said he shot him face to face, the hole was really large. The exit wound, supposedly, was really small on his back. Now in the court, what they did is they said, well, he was wearing a beaded medicine bag, and what happened is that bullet somehow mushroomed out to create a bigger hole in his chest after hitting that glass bead. And then somehow the bullet shrunk as it went through his body and then passed out without, as we know, spreading out. And which is what happens with a 9mm shot, is that bullet pushes things out when it exits out of that wound. What we can see from that is Richard did the same thing. He turned his back. He was shot through the back, and it came out through his heart. And that's literally what happens. And so it wasn't self-defense. Richard did the same thing. He tried to defuse the situation. He tried to turn his back on an assailant. Michael Oliver Morgan was charged instantly with first-degree murder. And this was it took the cops 45 minutes before they ever even arrived at the scene. So this gave them a chance to be able to set the scene before the cops ever arrived. And before this, Morgan was asking the cops, how do I get away with murder? And they were like, oh, killing Indians is no problem. We have a record of it, right? Hence the 6 people that were killed and their assailants never found guilty in a court of law. And out of this, there would be a 14-year-old girl that would be in the second story of the YMCA making beds in one of those camp houses, and she would oversee this event happening. She was a minor at the time. It was reported that she would give a testimony to the FBI, having seen Morgan kill Richard Oakes in cold blood. The FBI essentially hid this testimony. It never appeared in court. The prosecutor that was actually assigned to this case was fresh out of law school. He would later be disbarred. So there's multiple problems here when we begin to add this up. And out of this, of course, is charges would go from first-degree murder then to, manslaughter charges, which would be later found not guilty of in 1972, 73, at the time when Wounded Knee was happening. Richard's death was also, like you said before, Hank Adams made a call for a march on Washington. Him and Ramona Bennett jumped in a car as soon as they heard of Richard's assassination. Once they crossed the Oregon border, is when they found out that the charges had been dropped to voluntary manslaughter. And so he scheduled a meeting in Denver, and this staged the March on Washington in 72 out of Richard's assassination.
Sorry, I'm going to have to call time.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's where we're going to end today. But that really brings us up to the beginning of what is most known about the contemporary 70s Indian movement because of Richard Oakes right here, what happened here. I don't know if you know it, that there used to be, I think it was also in the 70s, the head of the American Nazi Party headquarters was somewhere up here in the Mendocino woods as well. So when you referenced that German gun, it's all the same old cycle though, isn't it? We're seeing it all again. Kent Blanchett, I really enjoyed talking with you. We leaving it on that note is sad and yet important, particularly for this audience, this local audience, to understand their own history. And we'll have to talk some more. I really have enjoyed speaking with you. You're very eloquent, and you said so many things. I'm going to go back through and make a bunch of notes myself. So I got to go. It's 10 o'clock. We have to go to Native America Calling. Kent Blanchett, University of Kansas. His book, once again, and you can get it at all the usual places. Journey to Freedom. I love that title. Richard Oakes, Alcatraz, and the Red Power Movement. Take care, Kent. We'll be in touch. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. All right. Wow, folks. I